So, I don't know why this memory has just come up. And I've been thinking about my childhood. These last few days. I woke up drenched in sweat, and even though at first, I couldn't say why, I think I'm finally ready to face my past. I don't know how old I was when this happened. 8, maybe 9. Back then, my family had just moved into a small house in the suburbs. My parents weren't rich, but we definitely lived comfortably, and I never saw them worry about money. Which by today's standards, I digress. I still remember some parts of that house vividly. My own room, up on the second floor, a mailbox, white and red, my dad's garage, where he kept the car and his motorcycle, the white picket fence with the small gate, my mom's rose bushes, and the trellis that had convinced her to choose that house right at the first moment she had laid eyes upon it. You know what that is, right? That strange wooden framework that lets plants climb up the facade of your house. My mom loved the idea, and when I talked with her a few days ago, she brought it up again, which, I think, made me remember as well. It all started about a year after we moved in. Late at night, hours past my bedtime, I was still up in my room, reading and playing. I couldn't tell you for the life of me. I was reading or what kept me awake. And I think I can remember quite a few instances of myself enjoying the night and the calmness after everyone else had gone to sleep back then. It was kinda my thing. You could say. Whatever. I remember hearing those footsteps outside, while still playing with my toys. And somehow, something about them drew my attention. Maybe it was because it was already late at night, or maybe they stood out because the neighborhood wasn't even lively during the day, much less after the sun had gone down. Or was it because they were normal footsteps? Not the sounds of someone walking down the street, but rather of a person dancing. It disturbs me to this day. I put down my toys and went to the window to take a look at what was happening. We had 3 street lamps along the road running past my parents' house, and just between the one on the right and the one almost in front of the property, I could see him. A guy, dressed in what I would describe as a gaudy outfit, complete with a top hat on his head, was slowly coming down the street. I don't know what kind of dance he imitated, but it had to be one of those ballroom ones. I think. He was twirling around, had his arms raised as if he had a partner, and kept to this strange rhythm all along. I was kinda intrigued. To be honest, it looked funny and infuriating. At least, until the man suddenly stopped. It was like he had frozen mid-dance. Had his head turned to the side while he was balancing on one foot. Yeah, I think that was the first time in my life I felt uneasy. Something was wrong about that man. I remember thinking. Then, I froze, as the strange man leisurely turned his head, then his shoulders, then slowly whirled around on his one foot. He looked up at me, not just at the house, but at me. I felt it back then, and I can still remember it so vividly, this feeling of eyes staring right into my soul. I watched helplessly as the man raised his hand and started waving. It might sound like a nice gesture, but believe me, I whimpered when I saw it. His face was covered by the shadow of the brim of his head, and yet I could still feel it, that he wasn't smiling. I pushed myself away from the window, jumped into my bed, and pulled the blanket quickly over my head. A very childish reaction, right? I mean, I was a child, scared and afraid because I still thought mom or dad might punish me if they found out I had stayed up past bedtime again. So I tried to resolve this mess on my own. Honestly, and I should have screamed my head off then and there, but I didn't. I kept cowering beneath the blanket, listening for the noise of the man returning to his normal dance routine. But that didn't happen either. All I could hear was the beating of my own heart, right up in my ears. I was crying, while I held the blanket over my head and prayed silently for the man to just disappear. Why didn't the footsteps start up again? I asked myself. How had he noticed me? Up here, standing silently in my dark room, my heart was beating so fast I thought it would break my ribs. And then the one noise I dreaded more than anything reached my ears. The gate to our lawn swung open. I was shaking in my bed. This strange man was coming. My mind told me. Coming. For me. I kept listening. I couldn't even hear his footsteps. My heart was still racing, drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. What if he rang the doorbell? Would someone open the door for him? I felt myself whimpering again, then clasped one hand over my mouth to stop any noise from coming out. Maybe the man didn't know where I was. I told myself. As long as I stayed extra quiet, he might just turn around and leave again. Looking back now, I really was completely out of my mind from fright. I could feel my lungs starting to burn with the hands still clasped tightly over my mouth. The only sound I could hear was my heartbeat. No one was ringing the doorbell. No one was walking around outside. I started letting out air again and tried to keep my breath shallow in silence. I failed miserably. Something about that sight had shaken me to my core. But now, there was no noise coming from the man anymore. Seconds passed that felt like an eternity. Then minutes. Slowly, my heartbeat sank and my breathing returned to normal. I was still cowering beneath my blanket, still shaking like a leaf while my pajamas were drenched in sweat. But nothing happened outside anymore. To keep myself from completely spiraling, I started to count my breaths. First to 100, then 2, then 3. Nothing happened. The night outside my window was calm and almost silence. There were no scratching noises, no footsteps, nor anything like that. I began wondering if I had just imagined the sound of the gate before. After a few more minutes, I even felt my muscles relaxing a bit. The blanket wasn't shaking anymore as my own tremors slowed, then stopped. Had I just imagined it all? In my childish mind, that really did seem possible. I wasn't sure if the man had existed at all, if I even had been awake before. Maybe it all was just a bad dream, I told myself. Slowly, I lowered the blanket. Just a bit, at first, enough to take a look at the window. The night outside was as dark and calm as before. I kept staring at it, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. My chest was still hurting, and my lungs seemed strained. I soon began to feel at least a little bit more at ease. Pushing the blanket to my feet, I ever so slowly started to move. First, I only put one foot out of bed, looked at the window and found it still the same as before. Then the other leg. All the while I was listening for any noise or sound from outside. But nothing was going on out there, so I stood up from the bed. Was it just bravado? An urge to prove to myself that I wasn't a scared little child. Not the thing that drove me on the most was that I knew I wouldn't be able to fall asleep if I didn't look outside at least once. All those nightmares would keep me awake. I knew. So I ducked down and started to sneak toward the window, always on the watch for anything happening outside. I slowly crept forward. Even though I tried to tell myself that it had all been nothing but a dream, part of me still warned me not to be careless. I remember those moments so well. The smell of my room, the toys lying on the floor, making me step around them to keep the noise to a minimum. The sight of the moon, full and bright, up in the sky between the stars. My hands were shaking slightly, and I could feel my heart rate picking up once more. The top of the street lamp came into view. I crept forward, past the small desk and the chair. The fence of our neighbor's lawn was calm and closed, and looked just like the one here. I started to grow hopeful. It had all been just a dream. Another step, and I was only one more away from the window. The night was calm, and I could still feel this strange tension. I swallowed my fear, took one more breath, then pushed myself forward. Down there, by the street lamp, was the gate and the white picket fence. It stood open. I could feel my heart almost jumping out of my chest. Sweat was running down my cheeks. In the light of the lamp, I could see something more. Footsteps in the wet grass, leading straight across the lawn, toward the house, toward the trellis. My mind seemed to crumble. I couldn't move my body anymore. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The shadowy shape of a gaudy suit blowing in the soft breeze. Right next to my window. A face, half covered in darkness. Eyes that looked down at me through the pane, staring right into my soul. He was grinning. I felt it more than I saw it. Grinning while staring at me. His face came closer to the window, and I stood there like a deer in headlights. I couldn't even scream. So scared was I. The sound of him, smacking his lips, has been engraved in my mind. I don't know what he planned or even wanted. All I can remember now is the noise the struts of the trellis gave off as the man shifted forward and tried to grab hold of my window's frame. This low, moaning noise, just before they broke. He let out a scream, and with it, I cried out as well, shouting for my mom and dad as the man fell down and howled in anger. Lights turned on all around the street as I ran away from the window and headed toward my parents' bedroom. I don't really remember what happened next. only that my dad removed every last piece of the trellis the following day, and my mom stayed with me wherever I went from then on for what felt like a year. I slept in my parents' room for the next few months, and soon after, we moved again. Somehow, I must have buried this whole episode somewhere deep in my mind. It only came up again when Mom talked about the trellis she used to have and the great plans she had for it, but never could turn into reality. Dad has already passed away, and I have my own family and children now to take care of. We live in a small, calm suburb, with nice and inexpensive schools close by. Only, yesterday, I woke up during the night. I remembered because that normally never happens. As I was lying there, next to my partner, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, dancing along the street. My daughter is 7. She's got the room next to us, on the second floor. I think we need to move. I wish I could give a more romantic starting point, but I just don't have one. I didn't do bad in school. No Einstein, but I got by and kept my head down. I kept that up after getting into college, pursuing a major in English. Dealing with kids seemed like a nightmare, but teaching was something I thought I enjoyed. From the few times my friends asked for help with essays and explanations of one of the 1,000 poems we were expected to learn, I didn't have a mom at home, but I wasn't under any circumstances abandoned. My dad filled up both roles, tried his absolute hardest, and I'll always love my dad. He was a baker but got promoted over time and runs his own bakery. His bakery is how I met Scott. I was helping out with moving the pretzels from the storage room in the back to the front, partially because of the pretzels being bought, mostly because of me stealing them and eating them. When he first came in, I took one glance, looked back at the pretzels, looked back at him and saw him looking at me, and walked back to the storage room still holding a whole bag full of pretzels. My dad gave me the worst side eye I've received to date and gave me an all-knowing smirk stating, "I know you're trying to hide it, but I can see you blushing." From there I only remember jumps and moments, from him becoming a regular, to asking to hang out, from friends to best friends. I wish the feelings went away for some pathetic reason. I wish I could have stayed his friend, because I know how much easier it is to be forgiven when love isn't in the equation. I tried for so long to not think about him, but I couldn't. He was the foundation keeping my head up, and he was the only thing in my mind. I loved the way he fixed his middle part in the wind. I loved the way he laughed, and how clean his teeth looked. I loved the way he smelled and how his hands looked. I loved the way he talked, the way he wouldn't let people be rude without reason, but would try understanding every side. Every time I looked into his eyes, I saw a heavy heart with a soft inside, and I wanted it all to myself. Every other boy and girl that looked his way ignited a hatred in me, like some unforgiven sin they've committed in my eyes. And I do not forgive. I do not forget. By day, the feelings were sweet and quiet. By night, they turned loud and violent. Thoughts of him looking at me and telling me that he isn't comfortable around me. Thoughts of him seeing me the way I saw myself. I don't know what I was more scared of. Him saying he'll never love me, or him saying he loves me out. Then from those to worse. How I'd react if he died. How I'd hurt and hate myself. What I'd do if he fell in love with somebody else. He was never mine, but I wanted it more than I wanted anything else in this world. We stayed friends for the whole years until I ruined everything. One cold November night, I had came over to his house and just to tease her again. I was doing that quite a lot actually. If he suspected anything, he never had the heart to say anything. I just loved wearing his clothes. His smell, his dead skin particles against mine. Something that belonged to him covering me and keeping me warm. I belonged to him. He wasn't mine, but I was his. He had this obsession over Fight Club, where he enjoyed the psychological aspects. I just loved Brad Pitt and Norton. There wasn't anything special about the night. I just got drunk and made a mistake. Something came up in the movie, some scene where the two are making soap. He said we should try. I don't know what I was thinking, but I crawled over to him and kissed him. He didn't say anything, but his body language said enough. The dead motion, the stillness, the mix of shock and horror in his eyes. I sobered up quickly after that. I stood up and left, still wearing his hoodie. I don't know if he looked at me on the way out. I didn't turn around. I didn't deserve to know. He didn't text again for a very long time. I cried in his hoodie till the color drained out of it, till the color drained out of my eyes. My dyed hair, my painted nails. I cried till I couldn't cry anymore. I'd like to say I got over him, but it would be a lie. I kept on with life, but the ambition I had died off. Being an English teacher turned into working full-time at my dad's. The personality I had liked about myself slowly dwindled and shrank until I wasn't that person anymore. The memory of that person was in the pictures of me and Scott I had saved as my lock screen. Scott's clothes I hadn't thrown out. I didn't turn to drinking or drugs or anything drastic. I just got on. Life felt dull and I knew there was no point of destroying myself. My dad deserved better. Yesterday marked 2 years of me and Scott not talking. I helped my dad cook some cinnamon buns, which I was more than happy to do. Cinnamon was a new favorite snack I had enjoyed. He said to go take a break since the shop didn't need extra hands until around 1 p.m. to where people would usually pop in for their breaks. We owned a building with 3 floors and had the bottom floor dedicated as a bakery and the other two were our living quarters. So I went upstairs and made a cup of tea in our staff room, which was really just our living room and kitchen. I turned on the TV and looked for something to watch for the 30 minutes I had but couldn't find anything appealing. I turned off the TV, took a long sip from my cup of tea, and checked my phone. Scott had messaged me. "Hey." Classic. I tried to hold back the urge to write a paragraph back. I kept writing words and deleting them and writing and deleting. Scott sent another message before I responded. I assumed you'd text SMT in a little sooner, but I got bored of waiting. Guilt bit down into me. I could have written something. I should have. The love I held never fully dissipated. It couldn't. Dating just felt like I was cheating on him. Sex just felt empty. Nothing could ever break what I felt, but that night hit me in a way I could never recover from. What apology could ever possibly be enough? I wrote back. My fingers were typing, but I wasn't writing in a collected, intelligent way. My body was typing for me. "Why now?" He responded almost instantly. It almost made me smile at how fast he had typed a response back. "I feel like I lead you on. I kinda always had to guess you were gay, but I just didn't think that you would." Why no? My heart was unbearably loud. My right leg was bouncing. My teeth were quivering. I didn't know what to say. There's no words that could fully express how I felt. How wrong he was. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault. I wanted to apologize and say a million things. I settled on humor. My fault falling in love with somebody who dips chicken into maple syrup. After I pressed send, I got terrified. What if he didn't find it funny? What if his humor changed? What if this and that and this and that? He responded with a shitty GIF of a crying laughing emoji with the caption ROFL. Nobody said that anymore, used that GIF. He's such a loser. Low blow coming from somebody who drinks Bloody Marys. Jokes became catching up. Catching up became talking, and talking turned serious quicker than I was comfortable with. He wouldn't bring up anything recent that happened in his life. Only asking about me and trying to expand things as much as he could. From spiked seltzer to bottles of painkillers. Nothing had gotten exciting. I never got addicted, but talking to him made me realize I'm technically sober from drinking. Since I hadn't drank in over a year. Then, almost out of nowhere, after him laughing about my cinnamon obsession, I mentioned I wasn't actively trying to be sober, just hadn't had anyone to drink with. He responded with a message I really miss teaing. "Wanna come over? I've got some Coke and some Smirnoff." Within a minute of reading the message, I asked my dad to skip work. After a heavy apology and a promise to do all the cleaning myself when I returned, I left towards the apartment's Scott said he was staying in. I knew it was just friends. As just friends as we could ever be. But my heart was racing. I was wearing the gray hoodie I had taken on the night I kissed him. I held my phone like a baby and kept checking down to make sure the message was real and that I hadn't misread it. It hadn't snowed, but all the local nature was covered in frost. It was still bright, but due to November it would be pitch black in a matter of 3 to 4 hours. The sun wasn't visible. The glow gleamed through the clouds and shined onto all of the town beneath. Rain was drizzling down with an apparent high risk of heavy rain, but at the time I thought my weather app was over-exaggerating. If I waited 20 minutes I could have had the bus bring me over, but it was only a 15-minute run, and I wasn't patient to wait any longer than I had to. When I got to the block, my first thought was how horrible the building looked. On Google Maps it looked like a relatively clean, gray-painted building. Ruins of some kind of apartment block begging for revival or a deep cleaning. The building looked all wrong. In every sense of the word. The graffiti was everywhere, but none of it was coherent. Odd sentences that made no sense. Strange drawings and strange glyphs. The concrete had some kind of outer coat that was peeling off. What wasn't falling apart was covered in vines. It stood out heavy in comparison to the two brightly painted yellow apartments on its left and right side. I went up looking for a buzzer but couldn't find a keypad or any way to contact the tenants. I had been behind on my phone bills and had not been prioritizing keeping my data paid, so I had no way to contact him. Half expecting it not to work, I pushed the graffiti-stained glass door. To my surprise, it opened. Dust and ancient cobwebs blew off the doors. Cold air blew out, as if the block had its own wind within it. I walked in and smelled heroin needles and crying women. Some kind of place tainted in heavy memories and violence. This couldn't have been right. I turned back and began to walk outside, but was greeted with heavy rain. I could have left. I was raised here. I'm adjusted to rain. Nothing was truly stopping me. But I knew this was the right place. I went on to Google Maps and traced each road and followed to the gray apartments and which between the colorful ones back home. I was too confident to go home. I turned on my phone planning to see if I can still access maps without Wi-Fi, but got greeted with the last message from Scott. A new one had appeared. I love you. I glanced over it and saw it, but didn't fully process it at the moment. I checked back down and read each word letter by letter. My heart ignited, and I dropped my phone in a panic. It hit the concrete hard, and I saw pieces of glass shatter and bounce away. I crouched down and picked up my phone. It went from a small crack to a huge one. Half my screen was a neon green, the bottom half a neon pink with white section lines like cuts. Only the middle was visible. Only the last text he had sent me. I knew he didn't. I got scared. What if he was doing something awful to himself? What if he just wanted to text his old friend goodbye? What if this was his goodbye? My mind snapped in a panic. What room was he in? I couldn't check my phone, and I couldn't check each room in this block. Think. Conversation. Laughing about eating habits. Inviting me over. Telling me the address. BTWM in room 14, it's on the top floor. Don't take the elevator, it's on its last leg. 14. I shoved my phone into my pocket, towards the stairs. The building didn't have any of its natural lights, so I used the broken screen of my phone to light the way. There was a yellow, stained rug on the floor of the stairs that followed me all the way up. Each step squishing some kind of unknown fluid into the fabric of my runners. I wasn't paying attention to smaller details, but I could imagine maggots on the floor crawling to the decaying, rotting body of Scott, dying alone next to the phone waiting for me. I sped up. His name was stuck in my throat between panting breaths. I let him out, screaming and pleading and begging, but I got up to the last floor. I stopped for a second to pant, and then looked up at where his door was. My heart sank into my guts. His door was covered in some kind of green moving vines. Some form of green tendrils moving, swirling, almost breathing. The ends were caressing where the number of his door was. 14. I charged into the apartment and tried breaking through the door but failed to break it down. The tendrils reacted and shrunk, tightening against the door. I followed the tendrils with my eyes and realized they lead into the room. No, they were coming from the room. Scott? I whimpered. Scott, what the fuck is this? Are you okay? The tendrils remained unchanged. I took 4 steps back, counting each one, and charged back into the door, slamming against it with my shoulders. I took more steps and rammed over and over and over and over and over until the wood reached a breaking point, and I ended up crashing right through the door into the apartment. I coughed. My lungs and shoulders felt like they were burning. I luckily didn't get any splinters or land on anything sharp. In fact, my landing was weirdly soft. I put my hands under me and pushed myself up to see the apartment. It was overgrown. Driving green vines, shifting and moving lively, covering each possible surface of the floors and the walls. Some areas led into masses of contorted greenery which had gorgeous red mushrooms growing out of them. The only light illuminating the room was a scarce yellow coming from the right to where I assumed the bathroom to be. I walked forward trying to avoid the vines, and went into the bathroom. There wasn't any of the bathroom left. From the floors and ceiling to the doorway and walls, everything was covered. Not an inch of tiles or plaster was visible. Pulsating, swirling, shifting and breathing vines moved across each other like snakes fighting over any ounce of color that wasn't green. A living tendril swirled, and I picked a single one and followed away over to where I realized all the vines were coming from a huge cluster of them in a particular shape. I bathed up. I wanted to run and scream and cry more than anything, but I couldn't. Something overtook me. I looked down to my feet and saw one of the ends of the vines had wrapped themselves around my foot. It wasn't a strong sensation like it was forced. It was warm, inviting. I took a step forward, and the vine let go, moving under my foot and making space onto the floor for me to move without hurting the vines. The moment I got close to the tub, the vines shifted and moved and opened up a viewing window so I could see the contents hidden within. I collapsed onto the floor beside and grabbed onto the vines. They held me back. He wasn't groaning. He didn't have that much left in him. His skin was plastic. Faded, yellow, shining. He looked wrong. Vines contracting and shifting around his exposed ribcage. He only had one organ left. No lungs, no liver, no stomach, no intestine, just a massive bloated heart. It was shining orange with a bleak white hue at the bottom. It was beating and barely contained in its unribbed cage. I rubbed the vines, realizing the pulsating of the vines matched Scott's heartbeat. I held the edge of the tub, feeling weak. A vine slowly moving and wrapped itself around my hand. It didn't speak to me in the general sense. More so, I felt the meaning. It went beyond needing to be understood. The guilt, the loneliness, all the girls he left behind broken and sobbing. I felt what he had felt in my absence. The good and the ugly. Scott didn't love me the way I loved him, but he missed me. And in his own way, he did love me back. I sobbed, crying from all of his pain passing through me. I felt like I was being gutted. The vines leached off of me, prying into my love for him. I wanted to leave. I wanted to leave more than anything. I loved him, but he's gone. There's nothing left of him. Nothing to love. I tried to take my hands off of the bathtub, but noticed the vines held me in place. When I tried to pull against them, they held me tighter and pierced into my skin, tightening and impaling and holding me still. He didn't want me to leave. Whatever was happening, whatever he was changing into, he didn't want it to happen alone. I tried to use my legs to stand and push myself against them, but I found my whole body encaged in their grasp. Scott, please let me go. His dead mouth didn't so much as twitch. The grasp didn't change, only got tighter against my body once I put any force behind it. I tried one more heavy squirm to fight against the vines, and that sent into agony. My arms, my legs, my hands, my thighs, all of them tightened and crushed my body, trying to lock me into position. The only thing I had any control of was my neck and my mouth. I felt my body getting weak, the pain shifting all throughout my body, making me hear my own heartbeat. I could also feel my own blood flow slow and boil into my brain, making every thought a nightmare to hold on to. I love you to Scott. I cried. I cried it out with a terror while my whole body was burning. I repeated it. I love you, begging and pleading and praying for the words to go through and for something to change, but nothing did. It just got tighter. I gave up and cried, weeping in the same place and moving my head down to try to put myself against the bathtub. I then noticed just how far I can reach down with my mouth and decided on one final idea. As quickly as I could, I moved my head down and bit down at the vines around my right hand. The bite made my entire right arm burn, as if I was gnawing through my own flesh, but I pursued. I bit deeper and deeper, seeing blood leaking from the vines. I chewed and spit and chewed and spit and chewed and spit until I had a weak enough section to tear my hand out of. As I got one limb free, all the others got worse, but I had my strength and I knew if I didn't fight now, I might never get the chance to fight again. I pulled on my left hand and moved it as close as I could to my mouth. I got it and pulled and dragged it into my mouth and gnawed. With both my hands free, I tried to rip the vines off my legs, but had no such luck. The more I pulled, the worse it got. I couldn't rip the vines off of me. What should I do? What can I do? I looked over at Scott's body. I noticed a small glimmer on his cheek that had fallen from his eye. Scott had been crying. He can't control this, but he's conscious. I know he would have wanted me him. I know he didn't want to be trapped there, in a personal cage. I grabbed onto the wooden ribs, keeping the strange, beating hard in his chest, and tore them. They were fragile, wet, weak. They broke off easily. I broke 3 more, giving myself enough space to reach into the chest and grab. It didn't feel fleshy or wet, anything you'd associate a beating heart with. It was almost rubber, some kind of smooth silicone texture that was soft and squishy. I put my hand underneath it and felt it beat and instantly pulled my hand away. The curiosity which had become Scott's heart had shocked me in some way. I looked at my hand and saw teeny specks of green injected into spots around my right hand but burned. I did my best to ignore them and wrapped my hand around the heart. The vines that still had a grip on me began tightening more and more, and I felt like I had seconds before my bones snapped. I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't take that risk. And between tears, I grabbed, I squeezed, and I pulled. The heart had attached itself into threads of flesh that wouldn't let go quite as easily as I wanted. I slowly pulled the heart closer in the direction of my head, avoiding the pain each beat sent from my head down my wrist down my entire body. After one blind moment, it tore. The vines had instantly let go and I collapsed onto the floor behind me. His heart had lost the pulse and color that made it so magical and strange. Replacing the rubber was an outer layer that had petrified upon losing contact to Scott's body. It was hard, almost wooden but not quite. It had jagged edges and dents, and along the middle it had a rough part that circled around it. It resembled a really big peach pit. It was a seed. I cradled it, figuring it was harmless now. I stood up and looked at Scott's lifeless body one more time. I weighed the pros and cons of kissing him, but settled on a fist bump. And through not in agony cried out the last thing I'd ever tell Scott, something I'd rather keep to myself. I went home slowly, taking the rain in every drop at a time. Every noise, every car, every person, every splash of a puddle felt so inconceivable, so distant, so pointless. I walked home, and when I got home I sat down into the corner and cried. I held what used to be Scott's heart against my chest as close to my heart as I could and I cried. Didn't ever think I'd have to use a fucking flashlight again. My son Josh stormed into the house in our dough, and I left to get us some food cause the fridge had fuck all in it. Sure, the traffic was a little much. But 2 hours of time is not enough for what I came back to. The entire windows from the outside were almost entirely covered in thick, growing, writhing vines. They shifted and moved, and rapidly expanded, reaching and clawing for more space to perch onto. I got out of the car without a slight thought of what to do. The vines found an open window and must have accidentally opened the door as the vines reached out into the outside walls and the pavement lining the floor. Josh is still inside. I didn't have my phone, so I rummaged through an old camping bag in the trunk and found a flashlight. The battery was fucked, but hitting it brought it back for a few seconds, and I decided if it was all I could use, I would abuse it. The vines didn't tear, but they moved on their own accord to avoid whatever force was being put on them. I opened the door and it slowly slithered away, as if alive while growing longer and longer, stretching itself as far outside as it could too. The small bakery with blue and white walls, and a cozy feeling now looked as if abandoned and left to rot. The vines only allowed small beams of sunlight to pierce through the darkness, and whatever fit through the unforgiving tendrils came out in a similar color, painting every surface of wood in a sickening green hue. The vines continued shifting and contracting, grabbing and feeling around different chairs and counters. Any baked goods that came into contact with the vines instantly rotted and became covered in mold. I walked around to the back room where the staircase up to my living room was. The light from the windows didn't reach any further, so I smacked the light into submission and got to see the stairwell in its honest light. The tendrils wrapped around the ceiling, the walls and the floor, shifting once I changed my footing to slowly climb up or hold onto the walls for balance. Vines hung off of the ceiling, curling and moving into the air as if confused fingers trying to find a point of contact. The house was alive. I walked up the stairs as quickly as my fear allowed me. The living room was in a similar state of overgrowth with one clear difference. Vegetation. Giant pink daisies coming out of the couch. Glowing blue mushrooms growing from the green that had coated the TV. The vines seemed to be growing out of the stairs that led to the third floor, which led to Josh and I's bedrooms. The vines on the stairs here were thicker. They wouldn't move. They were stuck in place and thick, and I tried to avoid touching as many as I could, but there were just too many. Once I finally made it to my son's room, I opened the door, but the flashlight ran out of charge. I smacked it over and over, but the battery must have fully fried on the way up. Josh? I called out for my son, but no words came back to me. The only response was 2 green pulsating orbs I saw in the corner of his room, beating together in unison.